This is Nkosinathi Madondo. I currently work at Mangosuthu University of Technology. I was recently employed as an academic support lecturer, in the TLDC under ALU, that is Academic Language and Literacy Unit. So my job is to support students so that they become effective, participants, within the university. So basically that is what I'm doing, at the moment. My research interests are in student development, decoloniality of knowledge, and social justice. I, in fact, grew up, in a condition of what you may call then was called black on black violence, in Mpumalanga Township, Hammersdale, in KZN, KwaZulu-Natal, such that I lost 2 years of schooling, because of that, but because I really liked schooling, because to me it was a way out of poverty. So I always find a way, to go back to school, But the challenge that I faced at school mainly was the idea that when we were taught, mainly we were taught in vernacular, in isiZulu, that is my mother tongue. But when exams and tests are written, we were asked in English. And so we lacked the vocabulary, to express ourselves in responding to questions. And so I developed an interest, therefore, to become a teacher. And so I majored in English, and I taught English for a while in a secondary school before I got a position, at a university. I worked at University of KwaZulu-Natal as an English language teacher. And the idea was to teach English in English, to develop this idea that in order to teach a particular language or to teach a content, if the content is structured around English, then people or students should be exposed, to the language itself, so that they can at least become effective participants, within the discipline, notwithstanding the fact that these different disciplines are structured differently. But of course, they identify themselves through language. And so language then becomes an important aspect in my, academic trajectory, if you may put it that way. Well, in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, I was invited by the late Professor Brenda Leibovitz, from University of Johannesburg. May her soul rest in peace. We were involved in a Southern African rurality in higher education. So the project was investigating the learning that students from rural areas bring with them, to higher education. And through this research, through this project, we learned that, in fact, there is something unique about students coming from rural areas, in that they bring with them some practices with scientific underpinnings. But when it comes to teaching now at university, these practices are not recognized or rewarded. So there is a sense of absenting, these experiences of these students. So to me, having also been involved in social justice projects, I realized that there is a social justice issue here, in the sense that there is some misrecognition and misrepresentation of these learning practices that students bring with them, which have scientific underpinnings. So for example, students in rural areas might have observed, something, say, for example, around the kraal, because there are kettles, there are kettles there. So around the kraal, you find that maybe there is always a green grass, But then the question, what causes this green grass? And you'd find that the cow dung, is always there. And so students observe that, and then they spark interest. They become curious as to what was the cause of this, and so on. in a sense, that practice or that understanding, you can bring it into the classroom when you teach, for example, about the procedure of observations in science. Although we talk about careful observations, but in the classroom, it should not be as if this is a foreign concept. It's a new thing that students have just come across with, Unfortunately, university education is at most structured around, practices that are valued in middle class, families, educated families, so such that the examples that we use do not really draw from the examples coming from these so-called disadvantaged or marginalized places. Yet there is so much that you can find there. Zipin and Fatah, for example, talks about funds of knowledge that you find from these areas. And what can we do to draw from this before we teach? In other words, as a starting point, we introduce students to what they already know because we want to teach a particular concept. In that way, we encourage participation, within. So that really sparked my interest in that students have something that they bring with them to higher education. What can we do to recognize this? And maybe eventually reward it, basically. Well, what I have loved about the paper is that it brings in, concerns that are facing higher education community, at the moment. The issue of social justice, the issue of recognizing all those involved in interactions, in classroom interactions, so what it is that you do to ensure that everyone within your classroom, they feel at home, they feel recognized, they feel they feel represented. Unlike now, at most, those who feel recognized and represented in our classrooms, in our lecture halls, are those who come from middle class, mostly educated homes, often white, and so on. So what sparked me is that the paper touches on the issues that are of concern, to the higher education community at the moment, and I think it touches on issues of inclusivity and in terms of how we design our curricula and pedagogic practices, because these are not fixed. Curriculum is not designed by curriculum angels in heaven. And so we take it as it is. It is fixed. No, curriculum as academic teachers, we breathe life to curriculum, as Jacobs argued. We breathe life into curriculum. And so we can make it a living curriculum that is genuinely inclusive for all experiences of those in our classrooms and lecture halls. Well, my biggest insight and learning was that as much as, one would like academic teachers, for example, in the field of science, to recognize what students bring with them, but it would be unfair to assume that all, academic teachers in the field of science would know the complexities of indigenous knowledge, for example. So that was a learning experience for me. And it is something that was even pointed out by one of the reviewers, So then what sparked me then was that as academic teachers, it means for me, we need to open up, in other words, we need to be open to allow other ways of knowing other than the mainstream ways of knowing, that are prevalent, that are dominant, in the discourse, in the field of science. What about other ways of knowing? As much as science is not really subjected to context, in terms of it's a generalizable, discourse, but what it is that we can learn from context, from everyday experiences and use that to access this complex, this abstract way of knowing in science. So for me, it's about us as academic teachers being open, to allow other ways of knowing, other ways of constructing science knowledge, rather than this one way of knowing, which is confined to mainstream, understanding, confined to laboratories, and so on. For me, well, the university itself, academic teachers themselves, even students themselves, would be, obviously, we cannot take whatever you find, say, from rural areas and use it, as something that can be useful for teaching and learning. But we need to, I think, do some kind of research in the local communities, or in rural areas as academic teachers. So what research can we do to identify relevant funds of knowledge that can be used, to access this principled abstract science knowledge? So as researchers, what collaboration can we have with the communities out there, so that students see that what they know, what is out there in the communities is relevant, is not something that is foreign, because in most cases when we teach, what we present in students, it seems like it is foreign. They don't identify with it. So one of the findings from this research, one participant, we call them co-researchers, was that they were in the field and, they were doing planting. But before she planted, she observed the soil and, plant rotated it to see which aspect of the soil would be relevant for what she wanted to plant. And the professor who was there was really impressed with the student, because she did not just plant, but she first observed the soil, and it did some digging, around the soil to see where she could put, the seedling that she wanted to put there. So the point is, if we drew on this practice, on this knowledge, on this fund of knowledge that students brought with them, maybe it would create a condition where even participation in classroom, even outcomes, that is pass rates, would improve, because students would have this way of engaging with the abstract knowledge, drawing from what they already know. So for me, it would be to have a conversation with the university, with the local communities, with the students, with the research departments or centers within universities, in terms of what kind of research that you can do. It could even form what you call community engagement, outreach program, but in the form of research. What can we research in the communities that could be relevant for what we teach in our universities? I'm still struggling with that. I don't have answers as yet. I would like to give credit to SARI project, because through that project, I was able to complete my PhD. So it talks about teaching science by drawing on students living rural experiences. So my PhD is revolved around that. So I would like to give credit to SARI project, and also I would like to give credit to Professor Bowie, Chrissy Bowie from Rhodes University, who really inspired me to do this, and who really helped me understand the role of theory in research. Without her, I don't think I would have been able to really complete my PhD. She introduced me to the main discourses about that are dominant in teaching and learning. Say, for example, the blame when students fail, is always on the students, without really critiquing the structures of the university, like curriculum, when it favors certain worldviews at the exclusion of others, So I really would like to acknowledge her for that. Sue McKenna from Rhodes University, who was my critical reader, as well as Gina Whisker from University of Bristol, of Brighton, who was also my critical reader, and as well as Professor Mkwashu, who was my supervisor. I think those people have really contributed a lot into my trajectory as an academic, as someone who really would like to contribute, to how we view higher education moving forward. Thank you.